The funeral ended at 2:10. At 2:30, my brother Ethan stopped me beside the fellowship hall and handed me a cardboard box filled with 16 years of my life at Merritt Packaging, my mug, a framed photo, my father's old brass pen. Then he gave me a termination letter. "Dad's gone," he said. "You're done here." I stared at him in my black dress, still smelling the lilies from our father's casket. I didn't argue, I didn't beg, I just asked, "Did you read the lease?" His smile vanished almost instantly. "Before I tell you why, hit like, comment where you're listening from, and tell me, would you warn your brother about a mistake he'd already made that morning?" Ethan and I had never been the kind of siblings who screamed at each other across Thanksgiving dinner. Our problems were quieter than that. I was 42 and had spent 16 years at Merritt Packaging Systems. The company our father, Robert Merritt, had built from a rented warehouse and 3 employees into a business doing nearly $8 million a year. I ran operations. That meant schedules, vendors, staffing, inventory, compliance, customer deadlines, and usually whatever problem everyone else had decided was mine by the time it became urgent. Ethan, 3 years older than me, was different. He could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with a signed contract. He was confident, fast, ambitious, and genuinely good at sales. Dad knew it, which was why Ethan had already become president and CEO before Dad got sick. He also controlled the company. Dad had started transferring ownership years earlier. Ethan held 55%. I held 35%. Dad kept the remaining 10%. So when Ethan fired me, there was no secret clause waiting to make me CEO instead. He had the authority. What Ethan hated was that authority never seemed to buy him Dad's complete trust. The tension became obvious when Ethan proposed borrowing roughly $850,000 for a new automated packaging line. I wasn't against the equipment. I was against the timing. Our biggest customer represented nearly 23% of revenue, and 2 contracts Ethan was counting on still weren't signed. I suggested waiting until at least one closed before adding that much debt. Dad agreed. Ethan didn't argue in the meeting. He just leaned back and went quiet. That had happened before. Ethan would present an expansion plan. Dad would listen, and then eventually he'd turn toward me. "Claire, what are we missing?" I never understood how much Ethan resented that question. To me, we were doing our jobs. He pushed growth. I measured risk. Dad made the final call. To Ethan. I was the cautious little sister who kept making our father doubt him. Then Dad's health deteriorated much faster than any of us expected during those last weeks. Ethan started talking constantly about what the company would need after Dad. I thought he meant succession. I didn't realize he had already decided that, once our father was gone. One of the things the company no longer needed was me. The building was the part Ethan never thought about. 10 years earlier, Merritt Packaging had outgrown its old facility. We needed more assembly space, better loading access, and enough electrical capacity for the equipment Dad wanted to add. The problem was cash. The company couldn't afford to buy a building, but doing it would have drained money we needed for inventory, payroll, and expansion. Around that same time, I received about $240,000 from my grandmother's estate. I added roughly $35,000 of my own savings and created Ridgeway Property LLC. Ridgeway bought a 24,000 square foot industrial building for about $1.18 million. I put in the equity. The rest came from a commercial mortgage. Merritt Packaging signed a long-term lease and moved in, so technically. Ridgeway Property LLC owned the building, and I owned every percentage point of Ridgeway. That wasn't a secret. Ethan knew. The lease appeared in company records. The rent appeared on financial statements. Board packets identified Ridgeway as the landlord. But over the years, everyone started calling it our building. Dad did it. Employees did it. Eventually, Ethan acted like it actually belonged to Merritt Packaging. I never corrected him because it never mattered. For 10 years, Ridgeway charged the company favorable rent. I never used the property to win family arguments, never threatened to raise the rent because Ethan annoyed me, and never treated the building like leverage. To me, it was a long-term investment and part of my retirement plan. To Ethan, it was just another piece of the family business. That difference only became important because of one paragraph in the lease. The original agreement ran through December 31st, 2026. Merritt Packaging paid about $14,400 a month under a triple net structure, and the company had one valuable protection built into the contract: a 5-year renewal option, if exercised correctly. It would let MPS remain in the building under a favorable rent formula. Ethan had seen that clause before. So had our CFO. So had I. What Ethan apparently hadn't understood was that the option didn't renew itself. There was a deadline. And by the time he stood outside Dad's funeral holding that cardboard box, the most valuable date in the entire lease had already passed. The deadline was June 30th, not sometime this summer. Not before the lease ended. June 30th in writing. Our CFO, Janice Holloway, had been with Merritt Packaging for 19 years. She was the kind of person who remembered insurance renewals before the insurance company did. On May 15th, she emailed Ethan that the building renewal notice was coming due. On June 10th, she reminded him again. I was copied on that second email. My response was simple. Ridgeway is the landlord. MPS has to exercise the option from the tenant side. I shouldn't act for both parties. That wasn't me being difficult. I owned Ridgeway. But I was also an employee of Merritt Packaging on something this important. I wasn't going to sign for the landlord and then pretend to make the tenant's decision too. Ethan never sent the notice. Dad was getting worse. Ethan was juggling clients, financing, and the transition he believed was coming. I understood all of that, but Janice had reminded him twice, and Ethan was the CEO. June 30th came and went. 11 days later, Dad died. 7 days after that. Ethan fired me, so when he handed me that box outside the funeral, the renewal option had already been dead for 18 days. I hadn't canceled it, I hadn't hidden it. I couldn't have taken it away from him even if I wanted to. He had simply let the deadline pass. That was why I asked. Did you read the lease? Ethan stared at me for a second, then said, Claire, not today. He pushed the termination letter toward me. It included my salary through that day, accrued vacation, and 2 weeks of severance if I signed a standard release. I folded it once and put it inside the box. I'll have someone review it. His jaw tightened. I need people who believe in where this company is going. That told me everything. This wasn't grief talking. Ethan had planned it. He had already hired Mark Ellison to take over my responsibilities. So I walked away. 3 days later, Ridgeway's attorney sent Merritt Packaging a routine notice the current lease remained valid through December 31st, but the renewal option had not been exercised on time. Ridgeway was willing to discuss new terms. Ethan called me before I finished reading the copy. What the hell is this? The lease you didn't read. He still thought I could simply fix it. What he didn't understand yet was that the family favor he had taken for granted was no longer part of the deal. Ethan's first argument was that I was punishing him. His second was that Dad would have hated it. You'd really do this to Dad's company, he asked. I was standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, staring at the copy of Ridgeway's notice. The current lease hasn't changed, I said. You have the building through December 31st. That's not what I mean. I know. I didn't lock anyone out. I didn't threaten employees. I didn't touch utilities, vendors, customers, or equipment. I hired an independent commercial broker and asked for a market rent analysis. The answer came back between $18,000 and $19,000 a month, triple net. Ridgeway offered Merritt Packaging 2 choices: a 5-year lease starting at $18,250 a month with 3% annual increases, or a 12-month transition lease at $19,250 a month, giving them enough time to relocate without shutting down operations. Ethan called the numbers outrageous. They weren't. They just weren't family numbers anymore. Dad built that company, he said, and Dad gave the company a renewal option. You know I was dealing with him dying. Janice reminded you twice. Silence. Then Ethan said, Fine, we'll move. I told him that was his decision. For about 2 weeks, he acted like it was settled. Mark toured industrial properties around Dayton. Ethan told people they would find something newer, cheaper, and better. Then the estimates started arriving. Moving our assembly equipment required specialized contractors. Another building needed electrical upgrades, networking, racking, permits, and testing before production could resume normally. The projected cost landed around $420,000. The realistic timeline was 5 to 7 months. Moving was possible. It just wasn't cheap. Then another problem appeared. Ethan was still trying to close the $850,000 equipment financing he had pushed for before Dad died. During ordinary due diligence, the lender saw that Merritt Packaging's lease expired in December. They wanted proof of longer-term occupancy before financing equipment that would be installed inside the facility. They also needed standard landlord documentation related to that equipment. The financing wasn't canceled, it was paused. Ethan immediately assumed I had called the bank. I hadn't spoken to anyone there. Janice finally told him. Claire didn't have to do anything. They read the lease. That sentence apparently bothered him more than anything I had said, because, for the first time, Ethan was beginning to understand the problem. I wasn't attacking him. I had simply stopped protecting him from consequences. He ordered Janice to go back through the records and find proof that the renewal had already been handled somehow. A few hours later, she called him. I found the emails, she said. Ethan asked. What emails? Janice paused. The ones where I reminded you. That was when he demanded a meeting with everyone in the room. The meeting happened 4 days later in Merritt Packaging's conference room. Ethan sat at the head of the table with the company's attorney beside him. Janice was there with a folder of financial records. My property attorney sat next to me. For 16 years, I had walked into that room as Ethan's sister and employee. This time, I was the landlord. Ethan started before anyone else could speak. Everyone knows what Dad intended, he said. We've been in that building for 10 years. Claire knows we intended to renew. My attorney answered calmly. Intent isn't the issue. The lease required written notice by June 30th. Ethan looked at me. You were running operations. Why didn't you handle it? Because Ridgeway is my company, I said. I was the landlord and an MPS employee. I told you the tenant needed to exercise the option. You could have reminded me. I did. So did I, Janice said. That changed the room. Janice opened her folder and placed 2 printed emails on the table. May 15th. Subject MPS facility lease renewal notice due June 30th. Then June 10th. Same warning, more direct. Ethan read them without speaking. On the second chain was my response. Ridgeway is the landlord. MPS needs to exercise the option from the tenant side. I shouldn't act for both parties. Then Janice pointed to Ethan's reply. Put it in the post-Dad transition pile. Claire knows the building. I watched his face change. That sentence explained almost everything. He hadn't believed the deadline didn't matter. He had believed I would eventually make it matter less. You saw this, Ethan said to me. Yes, and you just let June 30th pass. I told you what needed to happen. Janice told you twice. Our father was dying. I know. He was my father too. The room went quiet. Ethan leaned back. So this is punishment because I fired you. No. Then what do you call raising the rent almost $4,000 a month market rent? You know what I mean? I did. For years. He had confused 2 separate things, what Merritt Packaging was contractually entitled to and what I was willing to do because we were family. The company had 10 years of favorable rent and a 5-year renewal option. I said, I didn't take your renewal away. Ethan, you let it expire. He looked toward his attorney. The attorney didn't rescue him. Instead, Janice slid another page across the table. She had run the numbers. Staying under Ridgeway's proposed 5-year lease meant roughly $46,000 more in base rent during the first year. Relocating was estimated at approximately $420,000 before accounting for the disruption of moving production. And until MPS could show stable long-term occupancy somewhere, the equipment lender was not prepared to finish underwriting the $850,000 financing. Nobody had destroyed Ethan's expansion plan. He had created a bottleneck by ignoring the building underneath it. He tapped his fingers against the table. Dad would never have charged us market rent. Dad didn't own Ridgeway. That was the first time I said it that plainly. Ethan stared at me. He had spent years thinking that controlling Merritt Packaging meant controlling everything surrounding Merritt Packaging. But he owned 60% of the operating company after Dad's estate settled. I owned 100% of Ridgeway. Those were different rights, different responsibilities, different signatures. You could make this easier, he finally said. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. I did make it easier. Ethan, for 16 years. He looked up. That was the part you fired. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Ethan asked for a break. When he returned 20 minutes later, the anger had drained out of him. Merritt Packaging would accept the 5-year lease framework, subject to final legal drafting. Once it was executed, I would sign the ordinary landlord documentation the equipment lender needed, no extra conditions. No revenge clause, no attempt to keep his financing trapped. Ethan signed the term sheet. I gathered my papers and stood. He still had the company. He still had the CEO title. He still had the authority he had wanted so badly. But now he also had the responsibility that came with it. And for the first time in 16 years, I walked out of Merritt Packaging knowing that none of his unfinished decisions were mine to fix anymore. Merritt Packaging didn't collapse. That mattered to me. 41 people still depended on that company for a paycheck, and after Dad's estate was settled, I still owned 40% of it. Ethan controlled the other 60. Destroying MPS would have hurt everyone except the person I was supposedly trying to punish. So, I didn't. The company signed the 5-year lease with Ridgeway. The equipment financing eventually moved forward. Ethan's expansion plan was delayed, but it wasn't dead. He simply had to pay market rent while doing it. I never returned to my old office. 3 months later, I accepted a senior operations position with another industrial company outside Dayton. The first time my new boss asked me to challenge one of his plans, I actually laughed. What he asked? Nothing. I'm just getting used to disagreement not becoming a family emergency. Ethan and I barely spoke for several months. Then, one afternoon, he called. I thought you were always trying to slow me down, he said. Sometimes I was. He went quiet. Slowing you down wasn't the same as stopping you. He didn't apologize. Not exactly. But he didn't argue either. About 10 months after Dad died, we ended up at the same family dinner. We were civil, not close. Maybe we never would be again. But sometime during dessert, Ethan mentioned a maintenance issue at the warehouse. He didn't call it our building. He said, "Your building. It was such a small correction that nobody else noticed." I did. Ethan kept the company he had wanted so badly to control. I kept Ridgeway. And I stopped carrying responsibilities that had never belonged to me simply because I was better at noticing them. Owning the building wasn't my revenge. Refusing to pretend it belonged to him was, for years. Ethan had mistaken my help for something permanent. He learned the difference only after he fired the person providing it. Ethan thought authority meant getting the final word. What he learned was that authority also meant reading the contracts, meeting the deadlines, and living with the decisions nobody else cleaned up for him. I never took his company. I never tried to ruin it. I simply stopped giving him something he had mistaken for his birthright: my labor, my patience, and the use of my property on family terms. If your own sibling fired you and still expected the family discount afterward, would you keep giving it? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoy stories where the truth does more damage than revenge ever could, subscribe, because the next story begins with another family member who thought no was just the start of a negotiation.